Not all transitioning Mormons have the same experience or the same journey, but if you're going to be helping people on that transition, you need to understand one of the most common issues that many, if not all, will face is a sense of loss and the grief that goes with that loss. So let's start by looking at some of the common losses that transitioning Mormons will face. When the average person leaves Mormonism, he or she loses many things. They might lose a cherished sense of history and heritage as they feel now displaced from their people. They might lose friends and family connections. They might lose a sense of certainty about life and the world that the Mormon worldview and culture gives them. They could lose a sense of privileged identity, of being part of a special group. They could lose familiar life patterns and rhythms that are defined by the structure of Mormon cultural life. They could lose meaningful, life-defining stories, the stories that they've been told that help them understand themselves and their place in the world. They could lose much, much more than that as well. And any kind of loss that a person suffers always is accompanied to some extent by grief. And so even if former Mormons are glad to leave Mormonism behind, they're still going to feel the loss at certain times more than others. And some former Mormons will pine for and long for some of the elements of their former life, especially at certain times they'll miss being Mormon and what being Mormon meant for them. But like any grieving, then, it's going to express itself in different ways with different people, and it will engage a variety of different emotions and cannot be rushed. But you should understand that there are losses involved. And in particular, I want to talk about three of the major kinds of losses that people will face when they leave Mormonism. The first one is a loss of identity. Being a Mormon is a defining identity. And so when someone leaves Mormonism, they face this very important question of who am I now? So those pioneer stories of brave ancestors no longer belong to me in the same way they did before. I may miss certain beloved hymns. This sense of being part of a special people is now gone. And so it takes time for loyalties to shift and for a new sense of identity to develop in a person. And so even if the ex-LDS person isn't active in the LDS church anymore, even if they don't believe in the Mormon teachings, they may still consider themselves as Mormon in some significant way. And over time, many of them settle for a new identity that's defined simply by what they used to be. They settle for becoming ex-Mormons and really nothing more than that. Now, it's not easy for transitioning Mormons to sort out this new sense of self-understanding or how that new view of themselves relates to a new faith or a new church, and that's where you can help. But first, you have to understand this loss of identity that takes place. Now, the second kind of loss that most Mormons experience at some level or another is a loss of relationships. Former Latter-day Saints will often be opposed by family and friends on their way out of Mormonism. And that opposition covers a whole spectrum of responses from their family and from their community. On the milder end, the ex-Mormon may simply feel uncomfortable attending LDS activities because they just don't feel like they belong in that culture anymore. Or they may start to experience friends who just don't have time for them anymore, or family members who are distancing themselves from them now. Some have lost access to favorite nieces or nephews. Some are marginalized from family life. And as you move closer to the harsher end of the spectrum, some former Mormons have been cut off and disowned by their parents. For others, leaving Mormonism has triggered a divorce or efforts by their former spouse to limit their access to their children. And so, whether it's mild or harsh, almost every person leaving Mormonism is going to experience some kind of loss of relationships. And then there's a third loss that you need to understand if you're going to help these people on their journey, and that is a loss of equilibrium. Former Mormons may feel like their lives have been turned entirely upside down. Leaving Mormonism requires a reordering of their whole world, their whole reality, because the old authorities that gave structure to life are no longer credible. Rhythms of life have changed. Traditions and relationships that brought stability are gone. And as they explore a faith life in a new church, the symbols, the language, the structure of this new church are all unfamiliar to them. And so a person in that situation will naturally feel vulnerable and disoriented. And it can be more unsettling when something in their new church suddenly reminds them out of the blue of something that they experienced in Mormonism. And so this general confusion can really make it hard for a person to follow God, and it can make it hard for them to develop a solid relationship with a new faith community. That's where you can help. As you come alongside, you can help people deal with this loss of identity, loss of relationships, loss of equilibrium. We're going to talk about how in the next video. But let me just say this to close, that people who've never been through a major cultural or identity transition will have a hard time relating to what former Mormons have to navigate. But the loss is real, and it may require a long process to overcome. Keep that in mind as you help.